Well, hey now. Gotta scare myself sometimes when I do that. It's like, who is that guy?
Whoa.
Oh God. Fitz here, and I've also got my good friend Rick here.
All
Welcome.
right, Brian.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too.
So the concept for this started with a thought I had, which was to do a video around all the changes and the different kind of music that I listened to growing up. So many of us will talk about how in elementary, high school, university, those are the years often when you really start to open up. You're hearing different kinds of music, and you're exploring different things. You're more open to it, and it kind of hits you harder, right?
Yeah.
So I was going to kind of do that. I've been talking about doing this for a while, and you and I, Rick, have talked about this. I think I pulled out about 60 records that I had that I thought potentially I could talk about. And these would be albums that really were meaningful for me growing up. And this is kind of morphed into something a little bit different and hopefully more interesting. And that is that Rick and I are both going to go back and forth on albums that have really been meaningful for us and artists that they represent.
Oops.
So I'm calling this Touchstone Artists and Gateway Albums, with the idea that in most cases, these artists, be it bands or individual artists, have had a big impact on us. There's probably a discography there of things that we really love, but these would be the gateway albums that brought us into their world. But beyond that, I think that you can group things into genres. And we can imagine maybe that a certain album by a certain artist suddenly opened up our mind to a different kind of music, a different genre of music, a different way of listening to music. So that's kind of the framework for this. I think one of the things I would suggest is that from my perspective, I'm assuming yours, Rick, as well. We're not saying these are the best albums in these genres. These are albums that had tremendous meaning for us. And again, were gateway albums into another world.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job articulating that. I think that personally, I think you mentioned 60 plus. I mean, I actually went through a similar exercise and I ended up finding that, as I often do with this type of thing, where it's very difficult to be able to hone it down to this record. If somebody says, "What are your top five?" I always How about, when you did your desert island disc one, that's like, holy cow, what am I going to pick here, right? So I think, some challenges to doing that. But that being said, I mean, it's all very subjective, of course. And, that's kind of the fun part of it, I think, because even in our many discussions about all this stuff, it's always interesting I always learn a bit when I talk to you about things as well, because there's certain things you have focused on that I never did, or, had some awareness of or whatever. So I think this should be a lot of fun to go through.
I agree. And so we actually I was struggling a little bit about the framework. And so what we've chosen, or what I've chosen, and Rick has kindly agreed to join in this framework, is to create, again, somewhat arbitrary, but framework by genre. So, and then also, again, I think I started this off more chronological. So, for example, if you think about soul music, could have come into our lives at any point in time. For me, it just happened to be really, really early, and that was the beginning for me. And it may have been later for you, Rick, or whatever. So we'll get into a little bit of that. But
Sure.
I got to start somewhere in terms of framework. Um, so the first category I would say for me, I would call early pop radio tunes. So this would be stuff that I wasn't actively listening to. I might be aware of a radio station that I was listening to, but it might have been something that I overheard at my parents' cocktail party. It might have been a soundtrack to a movie that maybe we had in the house. I wouldn't have seen it because I would have been really, really young. So this would have been, for me, the really early 70s. And actually, I'll back up a little bit. I think we've kind of bookended this as being primarily a 70s time frame, because ultimately, although we're not exactly the same age, you and I would have experienced this music elementary, high school, and university, and that would have all been in the 70s, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty close, I think.
So what I've got here in terms of the early stuff, so I think of things like Glenn Campbell. I think of Tom Jones, Simon and Garfunkel, especially the Graduate soundtrack. And for the most part, None of this stuff had anything to do with vinyl. I was listening to AM radio, or as they say, it was found sounds that were on the radio. In the old days, you'd hear songs so many times that it would permeate through. You'd hear, stuff in the summer and Wichita Lineman. I knew that song. I never owned the album, but I knew it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about a period where AM radio was probably king and starting to transition a bit, right? So, for me, my context is a touch different, only from the sense that it's, AM, definitely AM radio, and definitely, that sort of mid 60s onward type thing. And as you said, I mean, there was, the great thing about radio in a way then was you had the Glenn Campbells, the Tom Jones of the world, the Engelbert, the Lulus, all these, Dusty Springfield. And then you also had the Byrds and the Beatles and all these different things. And then you had some different things that were played, which, the repetition over time. I mean, in my household, we didn't play FM radio until, I think I went looking for it finally in 1969, 70. So, AM was kind of the bedrock for listening, if you will, right? And so it's interesting the stuff that kind of, is still there. And, I think to what you said was, a big part of sort of growing up, right? So,
Absolutely. And one of the fun things actually is now hearing that music many, many years ago, because now it's all through the filter of nostalgia.
yeah,
So when
yeah.
I hear something like He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother, or, Pacific Gas and Electric, I don't even always know who the artists are. But somehow this whole thing kind of brings back, it's my rosebud, right? It
Yeah,
brings
yeah,
back my
yeah, yeah.
youth.
Well done, Orson.
Yeah, exactly. So the main thing about this period is that I had no vinyl. There was a tiny bit of vinyl from my parents' collection. Again, Simon and Garfunkel on the Graduate soundtrack, the Hair soundtrack, stuff like that. Probably one of the first records, and this wasn't the record itself. I got this because of nostalgia, but the KTEL records, right? So
Yeah,
20
yeah.
original hits, 20 original stars. They put in a
Yeah.
lot of these. And I had a different one that was more pop oriented. Again, it had that Burning Bridges, that title track from the Kelly's Heroes.
Kelly's Heroes.
Remember that? All that kind of stuff. This was more of a soul version of it, but a good segue to the next section. But this would be kind of a typical thing. So this has the stylistics and Bill Withers, and definitely more soul oriented than the pop I was just referring to. But I think one of my earliest records was a KTEL, and we in Canada, I don't know about the States, KTEL and the 20 Fantastic Hits, that was a big part of our lives, right?
Yeah, those compilations I think were significant for a lot of people, right? And certainly later in the 60s. But yeah, I mean, seemed like there was one every month, right? And obviously different genres, I guess, as well. So, but gave you a good kind of cross section of what was happening at that time. Yeah.
How about you? Now, do you have anything in that pop category
Well, I
you want to
don't
share?
have, yeah, this one's a bit oddish, but I don't really have a comp per se, but this is quite a well-known kind of thing from the 60s. And, this would have been running concurrently with, I guess, or out concurrently with the Beatles and all sorts of things at that time. But, you're really talking mid 60s. And if you said to somebody, gee, how popular were these guys? They were extremely popular. This, of course, because it's Canadian, was released on the Quality label, which A&M distributed through Quality, and eventually, I think, was re-released on Quality in a few different versions. Probably still their most popular record. Lots of classics like A Taste of Honey, Green Peppers, Love Potion #9. Yeah. But it's got that Herb Alpert trumpet thing happening. And, it was all over the radio. I mean, I think we even had one other one, I think, for the Casino Royale soundtrack. He did the theme for it, I think Herb Alpert did. So he went on to obviously greater hits and different things. I mean, founder of the A&M record label and all that. So
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It wasn't really part of our notes, but yeah, the A&M record label, right? Chuck
oh yeah,
Mangione and
yeah,
Herb
him
Alpert.
and Jerry Moss, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, the next one, soul on the radio. So again, I'll sort of share a little bit my experience was we had a cottage in Sarnia, and there was a radio station, quite a famous radio station out of Windsor, Ontario, CKLW, and they broadcast into Detroit, and they played a lot of soul music, a lot of Motown, obviously. And that was when I started to get some singles, and it was for me first hearing bands like the OJs. I can remember just jumping around on my bed. I mean, I must have been about 12 or 13, probably big enough to be breaking my bed, and just hearing like Backstabbers and For the Love of Money. And as a kid, like the baritone voice in the OJs, right? They smile in your face, and just, and I remember just mouthing that, like just absolutely loving it. I was just completely transported by the music, and it's very transportable. Lots of strings, beautiful melodies, beautiful harmonies, and then all these different voices singing different sections of the songs. And that again really came through on the radio. That was an AM experience for me, but it was also being at the beach in Sarnia and listening to all that music coming across from CKLW in Windsor.
Yeah.
And just a quick show, because this is really just a placeholder, as it were, because this would have been again AM and 45s, AM radio and
Cool.
45s. This is something I bought nostalgically, right? And this has got all their classics on it.
I was a huge fan of those guys actually, and I think yeah, I mean, I was going to say I am to you in a way. I mean, I grew up listening to Chum AM, of course, in the late '60s, and which was a huge powerhouse. Another radio station in the Hamilton area was CKOC, but CKLW was like one of the most powerful influencing radio stations in North America, right? I mean, because of the proximity to Detroit, obviously. And but yeah, I mean, they obviously playing Motown and all that Philly stuff in the early '70s, and the OJs and the Backstabbers and For the Love of Money, which is maybe one of the great all-time bass lines ever. So just a fantastic group. But yeah, there's a lot of that great stuff. I mean, I had a couple different things. Um, one of which was Canadian, and these guys were out '68, '69. A group called Motherload, and very well known track on the radio called When I Die. Um, Fantastic, sounds great on the radio, sounds great actually on vinyl. I finally picked this up. This is actually an original pressing on the Revolver label. And these guys were a bit of a mixed band with respect to personnel and players, and interesting, produced by Doug Riley, who's a very well-known studio musician, and Terry Brown went on to, I believe, produce Rush originally, or engineer for Rush, and all this type of connection. Big record. And then the other one, which was a classic, which I do remember, and then I bought the album on vinyl much later. This is priced at $379, so it was a good deal. Was Isaac Hayes' Hot Buttered Soul, and which is a real classic. But this has got Walk On By and Hyperbolics, Sibella Sequela Della Mystic, and By the Time I Get to Phoenix. But Isaac Hayes, incredible musician. I'm not sure I really appreciated for all that stuff back then. It was just, these songs are fantastic, sounded great on the radio, and influential in a lot of ways. It's amazing, the R&B stuff, how much it kind of sticks and has influenced so many other genres and artists, right?
Yeah, I recently really came to appreciate that influential aspect of his music, which I didn't know by watching I think it was a four-parter, the Stax documentary, and how important Isaac Hayes was for Stax Records, but also for the sort of Black civil rights movement and
Yeah, yeah,
was that
for sure.
Stax stock or whatever
Oh,
it
the
was called.
Stax documentary is incredible. That thing
Yeah,
is wild.
yeah, yeah. Cool, awesome. So the next category I'm kind of referring to is rock first blush. So this would be first kind of really coming into an awareness of rock and roll music. And for me, the first one would have been Nazareth. It was Razzmatazz. I
Uh,
remember hearing music in stereo, being aware of like what stereo headphones could do. I mean, it was my first high, really, truly, because I put those headphones on and the separation and everything, it was just like I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's like you never experience it, the same after the first time, but
that's
that
right.
first time was legendary. So, I kind of, for me, and we'll talk about for you, but Nazareth, Bad Company, Foghat, we're all in kind of that category. But if I had to have a defining album of kind of early high school days, I would have to say Alice Cooper and Love It to Death. So this for me, when I think about this, like Alice Cooper was a threat, like to parents, right? Like it was kind of like, where's the girl? Where's Alice? Well, that's Alice. And of course, we all had posters in our rooms of the guillotine, the snake wrapped around him. We used to just think he was the coolest thing, and the theatrical aspect of his shows. But also the song "I'm 18." I mean, for growing up at that time, there was no anthem more meaningful to me than "I'm 18." And everybody who picked up a guitar and picked up a bass and started a band in the basement, they were all playing 18. I think even I had a round of trying to sing "I'm 18," and you could if you were really plaintive. I'm 18. I don't know what I want.
Yeah.
And that's the end of my singing career. And the other part that I look I look back on is there is a dirty, grimy sort of like sewer kind of thing about this that prefaced for me Iggy Pop and the Detroit sound that obviously Alice is a part of. And the song in particular, "Is It My Body?" Like as a teenager, just like loving that song, that's really slinky, "Is It My Body?" And it's just sultry and slinky and sleazy. And you can imagine a teenage boy walking around going, "Is it my body?" And I realized I glammed onto that very early. And when I started hearing everything from Iggy to later, maybe John Spencer Blues Explosion, I love that dirty, grimy rock and roll. And Alice
Yeah.
did it first and best for me.
Yeah. That's a great album, actually. So many good tracks on there. I mean, I always liked as well, Still Got a Long Way to Go, and Ballad of Dwight Fry, which is a classic.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
just, yeah, interesting, right? I remember I saw them in actually one of the first shows that I had ever gone to, kind of preteen in a way. Um, and they played in Hamilton at Brian Timmons Stadium. I think I mentioned this to you. And so they'd come out, kind of all wearing like these satin outfits of different. Each guy was dressed differently. Michael Bruce, who was one of the guitar players, I remember had on this like purple thing that had like wings under the arms, and my buddy and I, who were playing in the band and started a band at that point, and we went backstage, got to meet a couple of the guys, Michael Bruce and Dennis. Uh, or Glenn Buxton rather, the other guitar player, who was a complete freak, by the way, but nice guy. And but they ended up playing like 6 months later. That was in the summer. We ended up Killer, I think, was released almost 6 months later. They played in Toronto and did the whole Killer thing. But yeah, fantastic band, and grimy, and kind of that Detroit thing, and a bit of the glam thing too, and the beginning of kind of a lot of the stage histrionics and all the rest of that, right? I've got a
Let's
couple
see
here
what
that
you
I
got.
see what I got. Yeah, I got a couple of different ones. There's so much to choose in this area, right? I just found there was so much that I had a really hard time picking some stuff. I'm gonna break the rule a bit here. I'm picking one from late 60s. Uh, Doing Truth, and this one was a very influential record, mainly because I think I found out about it in the year it came out. I think it was 67-ish here, and then 68, I think, was when I found out about it, and 68 into 69. And my cousin's cousin had told us about it. She was like, at that point, 3 or 4 years older than we were, so she was really cool. We were nerds. And I remember her going, this is a fantastic, because I was in love with Eric Clapton and Cream at the time. She's like, well, you have to go listen to this record. Have you heard Truth before? And went into all of that. But it's a fantastic record. I mean, between the, you know, I would say amazing version of things like Shapes of Things to, you know, You Shook Me to, Old Man, cover of Old Man River, Rod Stewart, Ron Wood, very influential band. Um, and I think really influenced, like, was kind of the blueprint for Led Zeppelin 1. I'm sure some hardcore Zepp fans would never buy into that, but it's all kind of there in the vinyl, if you listen to it and check it out. So, did you want to do another one? I've got one more I can
No,
throw
no,
in.
you go ahead. I just got my one for this one.
Well, this one was a very influential record, and I think anybody who was a budding musician at the time would have probably been totally into it. But this is the James Gang Rides Again, their second album. We were talking about R&B earlier. The opening track, which was a huge single and probably still the best known from these guys, Funk Number 49, definitely has got that. As much as it's a rocking track, the playing, the bass lines, the guitar work is very much R&B influence. There's no doubt about it. But a great, great guitar record and song record. Performance is great. Pretty clearly, once Joe Walsh was out of the band, these guys had a couple of Canadian guys come in, Roy Kenner and very well-known guitar player from Mandala in Toronto, Dominic Troiano, but they never really had the same kind of success. I guess Tommy Bolin later. But this has got some great tracks on here. Track Woman, The Bomber, where he goes into the whole Ravel's Bolero coda thing. And so, yeah, very influential band. A lot of fun. But there were just so many bands that were three-piece bands, guitar, bass, whatever, that were happening at this point. So,
Well, and one of the things that you and I have talked about almost every time we get together is one of the things we enjoy when we talk about music is that there's a lot that we share, but there are also things that like I'm aware of the names, but I didn't listen to the music. So hard to believe for a rock and roll kid that I wouldn't have known Truth. Um, but that somehow wasn't something that was with my peer group. We weren't listening to that music. I just got that album recently. So, I'm sure I'm familiar with it, but
yeah.
it wasn't kind of for me a part of my sort of growth into music and interest in
Well,
music.
yeah, to full disclosure, I mean, I think even for me at that point, it wasn't my friends and I were not into it at all. So when my cousin's cousin was telling us about it, it was like, and she was from Montreal, I think, as I recall, and from at that point. And so, it was something I wasn't really aware of. Yeah, I kind of knew Jeff Beck, obviously from the Yardbirds, but it was a revelation to hear. It's just so different. And the thing was, it was, um, I think Beck at the time, the record I think was known well. They had, those guys had done a couple of tours and blew up, I guess, as a unit. But it's a fascinating record because it's just so many different things are played on there. The guitar playing is exceptional, of course, for the time, and even today sounds great. So
So did
fun
that
album.
record precede The Faces?
Yes. So this was out, I think, 67-ish, maybe early 68. I think 67. The Faces, as the Small Faces, um, were together as a unit, I think, until 69, 70-ish. We could probably check the dates on that. I think Marriott left to go do Humble Pie, probably 69, something like that. And then Ronnie Wood and Rod Stewart had nothing to do after these guys after the Jeff Beck group blew up, so to speak. And I think him and Stewart ended up joining, the Faces. I think the very first record is still listed as Small Faces. And after that, by the time they got to um, Long Player and things like that, it was just as the Faces. So I think we're talking 70, I think, somewhere in there, 69, 70, something like that. So, yeah.
So just to wrap up, talking about Rock First Blush. So we've kind of wrapped that up. We're going to do another sort of section of that in a minute because we'll go deeper into rock and roll, obviously a huge part of both of our lives. So what's sort of phase two of going deeper into rock music? But
Yeah.
next up is a category that completely blew me by. I don't even know if I even knew it existed, much less that I knew any music from it. And that would be Krautrock. So over to you, Rick.
Over to me. Yeah. So, Krautrock, kind of popped into my life around 1971-ish and in the summer. And that whole year, I found that with my peer group, there was a lot of experimentation overall in life and lots of different things going on. And many of the head type bands referred to kind of the psychedelic type things. Floyd, obviously, with Amagama and things like that. But somehow, I remember we were at somebody's place and we were in a very unusual, it was a beautiful day and very organic about everything, and was introduced to a record by a band called Amon Duel 2, which I was totally unfamiliar with. Never had heard of it. And most of the people there hadn't heard of it. And the record from these guys was a German, in German. It's called Tanz der Lemmings, which translates into English as Dance of the Lemmings. And it's a double album set. I actually do not own it on vinyl. I have it on digital. And but incredible band. These guys started out as a commune, and on a commune, and there was a version Amon Duel 1 and then Amon Duel 2, and very much incorporating electronics and stream of consciousness type stuff. They were kind of linked with Timothy Leary at one point, and a lot of different things were going on with these guys. I think in terms of the overall category or genre, if you will, Krautrock, I think, really started in the very, very late 60s, early 70s. So many bands that we know of today, for example, Can, Kraftwerk, New, Cluster, Asherah Temple, Magma. There were so many of these artists that came out of that period. And the period, it seems to be, and there's a great book, which I would highly recommend if anyone's interested, called Future Days. And it's a great breakdown of the category, but less about the category, more about the music. Great features on each artist and why they were important. Interesting, I think it was really a sort of a post-World War II. Germany was rebuilding. There seemed to be, as in a lot of things around that time, a rejection of some traditional values and a lot of interest in kind of exploring different things and connecting to different things. So you had all these different things, different forms of music, all done typically in German in many cases. Kraftwerk started out very early on, for fans of Kraftwerk who know this. Kraftwerk started out very early on as a part of this, or maybe less so a part of the actual movement, so to speak. But, nobody was really paying much attention to early Kraftwerk at that point, I believe. And, so you had many of these different bands. Asherah Temple were very well known, for example, at the time. Can went on to much greater success. I think the music was very influential from the perspective that it influenced, electronic music, psych music. It borrowed from a lot of different genres as well. So you had, things ended up being used, for example, by Werner Herzog in soundtracks, Asherah Temple doing music for Aguirre, Wrath of God, things like that. I do have one thing on 12-inch that's an interesting thing, which is this is from Can. And this has got one track from the Future Days album, which is a later record from them. And one more from probably one of their best known records, Edgy Bamyasi. Again, very interesting bands, right? Interesting artwork, interesting shows. You typically had to be ingesting a lot of hallucinogenics, I think, originally with a lot of these artists. And that seemed to be a big part of the scene as well. But that Dance of the Limit was very influential. It was a great track on there called something, what the hell is it? Oh, Restless Skylight Transistor Child. Like, again, kind of like this weird kind of almost like a careful with that Axe Eugene type thing, a different energy, some incredible guitar work in it, just long tracks, 15, 19-minute long, songs. But just as one thing. And after that, there were many other bands that we also listened to as part of what we were listening to at the time. So it was a bit of a diversion for us as well. So
I feel like, for example, if I had met you in that time, or some of your friends, if this had been introduced to me, I'm sure it would have been another path that I would have gone down very happily.
easily, I know, you're a big fan of the Dead and stuff, and it's not really like the Dead per se, but the connection seems to be LSD, right? I think that sort of cut across a lot of different categories and influenced many different. They definitely influenced many of the artists, not all, but many of the artists here, especially in the early 70s. And, very different type stuff, spacey in a way. You can probably trace things like Hawkwind to some of this stuff. Um, yeah, it was very influential kind of subgenre almost in a way. And the music stands up very well today. That's the other interesting thing I find. Some is a bit dated, of course, like many things, but there are a number of records from these artists, all these different artists that were, I think stand the test of time, so to speak. Many of them still, cluster new. These artists you can buy today. If you go to our favorite shop at AudioPile, I mean, you're guaranteed to find an Amon Dual record, Amon Dual 2 record there. So very influential.
And would it be fair to say that a band like, let's say, Stereolab was heavily influenced by Krautrock?
Oh, I think so, for sure. For sure. Because I think a lot of they were quite inventive, I found. Many of these artists were quite inventive in their use of sound and the use of traditional instruments. And we're not afraid to kind of push the envelope, so to speak, on, the use of electronics and the merging of electronics into, I think a lot of people, Floyd, obviously, you know, I think were heavily influential for many, many artists, but there were a lot of things going on here that I found, were very good, very dynamic types of music, quiet passages, very aggressive sounding, and bringing it back to sort of this quiet thing, undercurrent of electronics happening in many of the things, sound shaping in the studio, different things, phasing, you know, putting your headphones on, as you mentioned earlier, and feeling your brain fry a little bit from things going back and forth. Interesting artwork, typically. A lot of these things, because they were in German, you'd like look at the cover and it would be all in German, but and singing in German as well, which was, after certainly some of the stuff obviously went in, were done in English, but yeah, very interesting period of music.
It's, so interesting if one of the themes of this kind of conversation is the idea of again, Touchstone artists and gateway albums of going into a whole nother world, right? Just entering a
Yeah.
world that was so different. You think about, let's say Alice Cooper and then the music of Krautrock, it would be hard pressed to find a through line maybe.
Yeah, right. And I just think there's, but music's music, and when it's wonderful, it's wonderful. And I think, and challenging too. I think some of the best records, in my view, are the ones that, in some cases, the first listen didn't really grab me, and it took a second or third. So, these are many of these records are, very interesting albums, very creative, a lot of depth with regard to, again, songwriting and all that stuff, but worth investigating, certainly, if you're not familiar with it.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So next category I've got here is rock going deeper. So really just ultimately, if I had to pick a genre that really dominated,
Yeah.
certainly my listening in high school and beyond would be sort of the general category of rock, R-A-W-K. And when I think about going deeper, this would have been probably a lot of the so-called sort of supergroups, Led Zeppelin, The Who, Rolling Stones, Humble Pie. You mentioned I loved Humble Pie. That
Yeah.
live at the Fillmore was just amazing. Smoking was another big area of rock and roll that I loved. And I think of the Rolling Stones in terms of how important they were for me in high school and 16 million other youth at the time. But also, what was the gateway in? So many people talk about, and it's a lot cooler to say, I first heard them in Let It Bleed or, Beds or uh, all the different early records. And of course,
Yeah.
the really early records, Mazzy might, talk about Get Your Yeah-Yeahs Out or something early like that. I've got two Stones records. So first one I'm going to show is basically the first Stones record that was mine, meaning that I heard it not long after it was released. I got it. Like not only I purchased it, but I understood it. I really enjoyed it. Nobody would say this is their best record, but this was my entrance into the Rolling Stones, and that was It's Only Rock and Roll.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some stuff on here that I still think is fantastic. Again, not one of their number one albums, maybe, but they've always had a great You know, I love Dance Little Sister. I just find that song just got this great sort of shaking your tail feathers kind of energy to it and very like a great tension throughout the whole song. And then, they always have an amazing ballad. So Time Waits for No One, still love that song. I think it really holds up really well. And the one that I remember, this in a sense may have been my introduction to funk, and that is Fingerprint File. I'm pretty sure Billy Preston plays on that. But man, oh man, if you ever get a chance, I think it's the last song on the record, so it may be one that's easily overlooked. That song is so funky and so got such power to it. And Mick talks about the FBI having files on them 50 feet wide and everything. It's full of paranoia,
Yeah.
and it's just got a really funky groove. So It's Only Rock and Roll was again my Rolling Stones record. That was the one that I called my own. And the other one is a Rolling Stones one as well. Rick knows what I'm choosing here. So this is
Oh
Bedspring
man.
Symphony. I was a big collector of bootlegs, and in fact, even was ordering bootlegs from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Still Rare Records. And I was like the drug dealer, but it was bootlegs. So I was buying these things and bringing them up in boxes, more and more boxes of bootlegs, and selling them, and then keeping the profits, as it were. But this was in Brussels. This Rolling Stones fans will know, if not this Bedspring Symphony bootleg, as being one of the great bootlegs of all time. And it was included in the box set that was released a few years ago as part of the Goat's Head Soup re-release. And I think it was released maybe even on its own on CD before that. But oh my God, the show, like I would play this over any other Rolling Stone record when I'd have friends over. It'd be like, you like the Stones? You gotta listen to this. And I remember putting it on and they're going like, holy crap, like what's going on here, And why didn't they release this, on the label? Because it was better than anything else they were releasing.
One of the great mysteries, right? I think it's interesting, right? I was just reading today, coincidentally, that today is the anniversary of the release of Get Your Yayas Out. And which at the time, I mean, I think you and I talked about this. We ended up I scored a copy of Liver Than You'll Ever Be, very well known bootleg from the '69 tour, which I thought they were just Greek gods at that point, as a young guy growing up. And so when Get Your Yayas came out, I loved the record, and then was exposed much later to the Brussels Affair version of Bedspring Symphony, and it just totally blew my mind. I mean, this is a band that was on fire, right? Why is it for you that Bedspring Symphony you prefer to something like Get Your Yayas Out? What is it about that record that?
The the performance, I think, was just off the charts. Like the way that they played, the energy that they had. Again, not that Get Your Yeah-Yeahs didn't have that, but the energy that they played. And the other part of it was actually the production. So it's not a perfectly produced record, but there's something about the way that it's produced. I assume it's a soundboard recording, but it wasn't like fully engineered, I don't think. It somehow, however they did it, it felt like you were in the crowd, like listening to Bedspring Symphony. It felt like you were at the show, like, even to the extent of the imperfection of the sound, but the fullness, the bombast of it and the performance made you feel like you were there. And quite frankly, there are many, many great versions. Like there's a great version of Gimme Shelter, but sometimes, when you talk about a record being fantastic, when you really distill it down, there may be one song or one performance that makes it like just head and shoulders above everything else. And that's Midnight Rambler. I mean, the version of Midnight Rambler on that is just staggering. I've never
Yeah,
found one and come anywhere close.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and I agree with your assessment. To me, this record is that record, the many versions, is so enjoyable if you're a Stones fan, because it's the band on a night where they sound like the Stones. Get Your Yayas Out is a wonderful record. At the time, I thought it was a great record. Learning later, of course, overdubs and all the rest of that. The lots of the asides, Charlie's Good Tonight, all that stuff, which is part of the culture nowadays. But yeah, that recording from the 73 European tour is an unbelievable recording. And it really captures a fantastic snapshot of the band. And I would argue at their prime. As rough as it is, as rough as some of the, a little bit of the crowd noise and all that, but the performances just slice through. That version of Midnight Rambler has got to be double the speed of what it ever was on Let It Bleed. Certainly faster than it was on Get Your Yayas Out. The Peruvian marching powder must have been readily available at that point. But the performances are incredible. The performances are incredible.
Mick
And
Taylor's guitar,
Mick
right, as
sounds
well.
good. Mick on harmonica, again, underrated, but fantastic. But just a great, great record. Interesting, your other choice too, if I may, on the It's Only Rock and Roll. That was a record I remember I was very excited when it came out. And afterwards I was kind of a bit, it's good, but in hindsight now, it's kind of the swan song of that version of the band with Mick Taylor. Ronnie Wood's on, co-wrote or whatever. It's Only Rock and Roll, all of that. But yeah, there's some fantastic tracks on there. Time Waits for No One. I was like Short and Curly's, I think, is on that record as
Yeah,
well. Plus
yeah,
that great Guy Pellart artwork on the cover. It's just,
yeah.
again, a stellar job of, the whole package, the music, the covers, the art, just a great, great record.
Yeah, yeah. Again, back to what I was saying earlier about, no one would say it's their best, but it was just the right record at the right time for me. And it's not on the insert, but there's that one that they had as part of marketing. You were talking about the artwork, but
Yeah.
there's a picture out there somewhere, and it's not in the album. It's not in the liner notes either, of Mick, like or a cartoon of Mick, and there's like somebody's driving a ballpoint pen, not a ballpoint pen, a fountain pen
Oh, I've
into
seen
his
that. Yeah.
heart. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And he's like going, ah.
Yeah. Yeah. He's got the sailor outfit on with the,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And that's part of the song, right? If I were to, but
Yeah. Yeah.
basically bleeding for you, the
Yeah. Yeah.
audience. Anyways, what do you got for your deep?
Excellent choices, my friend, as usual. Some different things here. Again, we've talked about how, it's at this time, it's about as deep as it is wide with respect to the variety and stuff. I'm picking something a little different here. Very underrated band, in my view. The band Mountain, most people know from um, the first record, Mountain Climbing, and the track Mississippi Queen, where after honky tonk women probably popularized the sale of cowbells worldwide. This is a record that's a very interesting album from these guys. Um, and this record is half studio, half live. So the studio tracks, there's some really good tracks on here, well-known tracks from the band. And then the side two on the vinyl has a 24-minute, 27-second sequence called The Dream Sequence is the title. In there, it's got guitar solo, Leslie West, rollover Beethoven, track called Dreams of Milk and Honey, and of course they finish up with Mississippi Queen. But this was a great record. I was a big fan of these guys because I always liked Leslie West as a guitar player. I thought after they were sort of like continuation of Cream in many ways because of the Felix Pappalardi connection as a producer and playing bass. I had a Les Paul Jr. guitar at the time. Hardly anybody was playing them, but if you're a guitar player, the master of guitar tone, and it's worth it to get just to hear the Dream Sequence. And you can play it on any of the streaming services. You want to hear some amazing powerhouse guitar. The track Dreams of Milk and Honey, which was on the first Leslie West Mountain album, the version there is very understated. This version they just let loose. Some crazy, crazy sounding guitar work and riffs, but worth checking out. It's just one of those great records from the period. Not the best known record, but probably one of the live version certainly is. The live stuff is great. I got to cover a couple of quickies here.
Yeah.
I never hear too much about Traffic. And one of my favorite bands, this band I got turned on to, my buddy lent me this, and it was so different from everything else I was playing at the time. But this is the original version released on Polydor in Canada, stereo playable mono. And fantastic album. It's got that kind of soft kind of finish. If that's not like a 70s record cover, I don't know what is, with respect to the gatefold. They're down to a three-piece at this point because the band had gone through some different iterations. Dave Mason had left. Some fantastic songs, Glad, Freedom Rider, bordering into almost jazz type stuff. Uh, Winwood's playing, I think, all the guitar work on here. Chris Wood, of course, doing winds and sax and stuff. And Jim Capaldi, underrated drummer, songwriter, but a really, really good record. British folk type track as the title track. Highly recommended. If you don't have it, it's a great record you can play anytime. People love it when you play it. And the last one, I'm going to a little indulgent here, was these guys. I don't know if you've heard these guys.
Only by name.
So, this is a record called Atomic Rooster. This is an original version of it. There's a later cover they've since changed on this on different pressings. The story with these guys is Vincent Crane played organ with Arthur Brown Fire, and was part of that kind of late 60s British, whatever it was, neo-psychedelic, whatever you want to call it, some R&B influence, kind of rock, but it bordered into a kind of a prog rock thing. I know for some people, prog is a no-no. Interesting album. It's a three-piece. Also, original member of the band before this was released was Carl Palmer, who went on to play with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And this is a very good record. Death Walks Behind You. Tomorrow Night was probably the best known track. But a three-piece of organ, with the bass being played by Vincent Crane, guitar being played by John Cann, and Paul Hammond on drums. So a three-piece, again, trio, weird, sort of, no, Vincent plays all the bass lines through a combination of strong left hand and foot pedal techniques, coupled with special sound reproduction devices fitted in his Hammond. Yeah, so only in the 70s, right? But again, interesting record, worth playing, worth checking out. Kind of fun, a bit prog, more on the rock side, which is kind of where I kind of like that kind of stuff personally. But something different from that period.
Great, Brett. Thanks for sharing. And did Atomic Rooster have much of a discography, or how many records they put out?
There's quite a few records. They ended up doing stuff with, I think the early stuff was with Carl Palmer. I think the first record maybe. And I'm actually not that familiar with the total catalog. Chris Farlow, well-known British vocalist, actually sang with him for a few records as well. Vincent Crane ended up dying. I think he committed suicide or something at one point. So that was probably the end of that with the band, and probably died with him, I would think. But yeah, interesting, underrated kind of, from certainly of that period, not particularly dated sounding at all, but interesting band.
Back to Mountain. So Mountain played Woodstock, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
And didn't they famously say that their management said we don't want to be included in the film or the soundtrack?
That's my recollection, although I do know that there was the Woodstock album was such a smash right after the movie, the original album. And there was a second Woodstock album on vinyl that was released later, which I think it must have come out a year or two later. And on that, I think Mountain play on there, if I can remember. Somebody may be able to prove us wrong on this, but I think they do play on there. I think it's got like the Dead, Creedence were on there, but don't think the album ever did much. But I do think they probably were. I think your recollection is probably correct on that. I mean, there was footage of the performance. It's good, So I could see why they may have said, maybe not. But yeah, really good band. I mean, as a three-piece, four-piece, I think at that point. They had a keyboard player, four-piece. Guy named Steve Knight did kind of the plunky organ keys, all of that kind of stuff. But very good songwriting. Corky Lang was a Canadian, by the way. I don't know if you knew that. He was the drummer.
No.
Canadian guy, Montreal. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. So we have a little placeholder here for Prog, and I wondered if we can address it, but also whether you've got anything that you want to show off in the Prog camp.
You know what? I could. Of quickly, if you'll
Hmm.
allow me one,
Yeah.
3 or 4 seconds. Sorry for that little diversion, folks. Yeah,
Let's
so
look
a
at
couple
it.
of interesting things. I didn't get, I found with personally, I know a lot of people love Prog, and I was to me, it was part of what was happening when I was listening to lots of other things. So my tastes are typically quite wide. Um, I did get into some things. I tried to get some of what I thought were some of the better things. This is the second album from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, released in, I think, 70. Um, and this is a original gatefold. So that's the sort of the complete cover, if you will. And then this is the inside. And interesting album for anybody who's not into Emerson, Lake and Palmer. This is not the album Love Beach, which is an abomination in my opinion. But this has, of course, Keith Emerson, Greg Lake from Keith Emerson, originally from The Nice, of course, and Greg Lake, originally from some fame, I guess, from uh, King Crimson, in the Court of the Crimson King, and I think Lizard and a couple other records there, maybe. Um, and Carl Palmer, who came from the aforementioned band Atomic Rooster. So interesting record, very kind of it's composed of one side one, which is a bunch of pieces all almost like one complete record, one complete side, if you will. They all have different names or whatever. And then the other side is more individual songs. But, an interesting record where these guys, again, three-piece keyboards, synthesizers, Moog synthesizers typically for Keith Emerson, and Greg Lake on bass, vocals, some guitar work as well, and Carl Plummer, drummer extraordinaire. Um, Probably not their most commercial record, but definitely I did look this one up a bit at one point. It's, in Canada, it was a gold record, which means in Canada it was 50,000 copies, which was significant at the time. This came after their first record, Lucky Man. Not the best introduction to any of their stuff, probably that first one. The first album might be a better one. It's got Lucky Man and things like that. This has things like Bitches Crystal, Jeremy Bender, Are You Ready, Eddie? Eddie Offord was the producer on it. But yeah, it's an interesting category, I think, from the perspective of just pushing the boundaries again on music. You can debate certainly how, you know, um, self-indulgent it was. Personally, I found it got very self-indulgent. This is my opinion. There are a lot of bands, Yes, and I have the Yes Songs album here I could show if you, but just as an example, kind of cool, interesting artwork, Roger Dean artwork, spacey. This is almost like a live greatest hits. I bought this in 1973, I think, when it was released. I bought it in Quebec because I was going to school there at the time at university. Um, but I went and saw these guys in with the release of a record called Tales of the Topographic Oceans.
I
And I'm
remember that.
bringing that up because I just found I totally lost interest in the band, and I kind of put a stake in the heart of Prog for me at that point. I just found it so self-indulgent and uninteresting. And however, we all like what we each like, and yeah, I'm
Well,
not sure what
that's
your thoughts are on Prog.
Yeah, I mean, Prog was another thing that, unlike Krautrock, Krautrock just didn't even appear in
Yeah,
my window at all. So I didn't even pass any judgment on it. With Prog, for some reason, my group of friends, they weren't listening to King Crimson, and the gateway in would have been Genesis. And I can
yeah.
remember hearing early Genesis. I don't know which album it was, but there was a song that reminded me of what was it? There was an old cartoon, and Stand Up and Fight because we know we are right. Da 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 da.
Oh,
And the Genesis song was The Knife. And it
Right.
reminded me of this like kind of cheesy intro to a animation thing. And that just immediately rubbed me the wrong way. And I couldn't get into Genesis at all. And I remember very well in high school, there were a whole group of people who were like so into the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.
Yeah.
And I've got no opinion on it because I had already kind of written them off in terms of my own personal interest. And I think Prog, for the most part, was that was the brush that I, basically colored my lack of interest in Prog at all. Did listen to a little bit of Yes. I can't remember which one, whichever one had, was it Fragile or Not Fragile?
Oh, yeah, yeah, Fragile.
And Roundabout. Roundabout is a beautiful song and beautifully played, but it's not really Prog to me. Maybe it is a bit, but so Prog was not a part of my life. And I think about this gap. There probably was about 2 or 3 years where I had the possibility of getting into Prog. And
Mm.
then, like you, like when the next wave came, I had no room for Prague. Like I was not interested in that. And this is as much an admission of limited, like being in a silo and saying all that other stuff is crap because I was putting even Led Zeppelin and everything into that category.
I had literally stopped buying stuff and picking stuff up. And the only thing that I had ever got, I think, later was from a British band called Marillion in the 90s, who were kind of doing the original Genesis thing with the singer whose name was Fish, and the makeup and the on stage thing, and very much the Prague thing. Didn't mind a couple of those records. Script of the Jester's Tear. I forget. Maybe that's. I'm thinking maybe that's another bit. But anyways, I think there. Yeah, I kind of lost interest. I just found it to be a lot. I'm much more into. I don't really want to hear a 30-minute piece of music. It's just not my thing for that. Self-indulgent. It got to that point for me,
Right.
and I think to your point, that Fragile is a great record. The Yes album's a great record. I think Close to the Edge, it's good, but after that, it starts to peter a bit. And picking on Yes here, but I think if you look at many of these artists, you could. I made a joke, a comment earlier for people who love Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The Love Beach album is generally reviled. I don't know anybody who admits to owning it, but I know some people who love Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They don't admit they own it. So it's one of those types of things.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is we haven't really cut a category specifically, I guess, for what would, let's say, Pink Floyd be joining. And I don't think of Pink Floyd really as prog. I don't know exactly where they would fit into things. Because again, with Careful of That Axe Eugene, you've got the refinement of Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, and then Animals, very different. But the early stuff like Metal and everything, is that not prog adjacent in a way?
You can make that argument, I would think. I think that I think they're one of those bands that's in a way genre busting. They started out as a psychedelic band. They kind of got into this again, another subgenre of some sort, probably with space rock, where they were doing their thing, and they had groups like Hawkwind, and they also had the Krautrock thing happening, and so and then they morphed into kind of less of the experimentalism and more of kind of the focus on songwriting. You can argue, but you're talking, in my view, anyways, anything after Obscured by Clouds, probably. After that, I lost a lot of interest with those guys, but with Floyd as an example. So yeah, you're probably right. I just think interesting band, right?
I mean, in a way, it's so dismissive, but at the time I would have called it stoner rock because literally it was the music you listened to when you got high.
It was, I think I alluded to it earlier that my, my friends and our whole foray into krautrock was driven by Floyd and listening to, Umagumma and things like that. It was a natural progression to go to this stuff. The the recording of a Small Creatures in a Cave or whatever that track is from Umagumma, right? I mean, yeah, the studio stuff. It's yeah, difficult to define, and in a way, is one of the challenges when we're talking about genres because some of these things bleed into other areas, but that's fine, right?
Mhm.
Who
Yeah.
cares?
When I was had an interview with John Digital Gramophone, and we were kind of talking about genres, and we were just talking about how as descriptors, it's very helpful because you have a starting point to be able to group things together
Right.
or to explain something, but that it's ultimately extremely limiting because really great artists certainly go off in multiple directions.
They're interesting. It's interesting to use those things as kind of placeholders, and I think they help my primitive brain, anyways, help understand it a bit. And then if it's something new or different, but you can't help it. I think, to a certain degree, it's a descriptor, as you said, and that's a great way to put it, I think.
Yeah.